She said it like she'd been rehearsing it in the car. "You never help me with anything, Ethan. Not with this house, not with the kids, not with any of it. My name is Ethan, and I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next." I'd heard some version of that sentence probably 200 times in 11 years of marriage, and every other time, I'd flinched. That night, standing in our bedroom doorway at 11 o'clock while she yanked open her closet, I didn't flinch at all. Something in me had already gone very still, the way a house goes still right before the power cuts out completely. "Fine," I said. "Let's pack, then." She stopped with a hanger in her hand and looked at me like I'd said something in a language she didn't speak. "I'm an electrician, have been for 14 years, since I was 22 and too broke to finish the associate's degree I'd started. I spend my days inside other people's walls, tracing wires that have gone bad, finding the exact point where a connection failed long before anyone noticed the lights flickering. I mention that because it matters, because for the better part of a year, I'd been doing the same thing at home, except nobody was paying me for it, and the person whose wiring I was tracing was my own marriage." Claire worked as an event coordinator for a venue company downtown, the kind of job that came with genuine talent and genuine exhaustion in equal measure, and for most of our marriage I'd been proud of her for it in the uncomplicated way you're proud of someone you love. We had 2 kids, Maya, 12, sharp and watchful in a way that sometimes made me feel like she saw more than a 12-year-old should have to see, and Jack, 7, who still believed, that year, that thunderstorms were dragons arguing in the sky. The fight that night had started over something so small I could barely reconstruct it later: a load of laundry left in the dryer, a comment about Jack's soccer schedule, some ordinary Tuesday friction that shouldn't have been able to hold the weight of what came next. But Claire had been building towards something for weeks, I realized later, looking back at the pattern of small provocations, minor accusations, moments where she seemed to be searching for a reason rather than reacting to one. "You never help me with anything," she said again, louder this time, already pulling blouses off hangers. "I do everything in this house. I do everything for these kids. I can't do this anymore." I stood there in the doorway and felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was clarity. Not hurt, exactly, that would come later, in waves I didn't see coming, but a kind of cold, clean recognition that whatever this fight was actually about, it wasn't about laundry. "Okay," I said again. "You need help packing. I'm right here." I walked into the closet and started pulling down her suitcase from the top shelf, the good one, the one we'd bought for our 10th anniversary trip to Nashville, back when we still took trips like that. She stared at me the whole time I unzipped it and set it open on the bed, and something in her face flickered, not gratitude, nothing that simple, but something closer to being caught off guard by a version of me she hadn't planned for. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because it's the one I keep coming back to, 2 years later. A husband, calmly folding his wife's clothes into a suitcase while she stood a few feet away, still holding a hanger, no longer sure what she was supposed to do with it. I didn't know yet, that night, about Derek Voss. I didn't know about the venue company Christmas party 8 months earlier, or the specific angle of a hallway conversation Maya had witnessed from a doorway at a mall she wasn't supposed to be exploring alone that spring. I didn't know about the $6,000 that had quietly disappeared from our joint savings account over the previous year, redirected in small increments towards something Claire had labeled, in her own private spreadsheet, as contingency. I didn't know that the sentence "you never help me" had been assembled carefully, over weeks, into a story Claire needed to believe about our marriage so she could stop believing a much harder story about herself. All I knew, standing in that bedroom, folding a green blouse I remembered her wearing to Maya's kindergarten graduation, was that something had shifted permanently in the room, and that I was no longer the man who flinched. Claire and I met at a mutual friend's barbecue when I was 23, doing residential wiring for a contractor who paid me under the table more often than not, and she was 21, finishing her degree in hospitality management with a 5-year plan already mapped out in a notebook she still has somewhere. She grew up the middle of 3 sisters in a house where her older sister got the praise for grades and her younger sister got the attention for being the baby, and Claire, this is something she told me herself, early on, in the kind of vulnerable late-night conversation you have in the first year of dating, grew up learning that if she wasn't the smartest or the cutest, she'd better become the most useful, the one who organized everyone's birthdays and remembered everyone's allergies and made herself indispensable in 100 small, exhausting ways. I didn't understand, for years, that this had left something unfinished in her, a hunger to be truly seen, not for what she did for other people but for who she actually was underneath it. I thought her drive to be useful was just personality. I didn't understand it as a wound until much later, when I had every reason to look back at everything with new eyes. We married when I was 25, her 23. The first few years were good, genuinely good, not the kind of good you have to talk yourself into remembering. I was building my own electrical contracting business, working long hours but coming home present, and Claire was climbing at the venue company, moving from part-time coordinator to full-time to eventually running events on her own. Maya came along when Claire was 26. Jack came 7 years after that, a surprise we were happy about even when we were tired. The trouble, if I trace it back honestly, started small and specific. My business grew faster than I expected, which meant longer days, which meant I started missing dinners, then bath times, then eventually whole weekends during our busiest stretches. I told myself, the way men like me always tell ourselves, that I was doing this for the family, that the tired, exhausted version of me who fell asleep on the couch at 8:30 was still somehow a good husband because of what the exhaustion was buying us. Claire's complaints started around then, not the explosive kind, just small comments, tired sighs when I texted that I'd be late again, a particular quality of silence when I walked in after Jack was already asleep. I want to be honest here, because if I only tell you her failures, this story isn't true. Some of what she said, in those early complaints, was fair. I had gotten swallowed by work in a way that left her doing almost all of the invisible labor of our household, the school forms, the pediatrician appointments, the birthday parties, the mental inventory of everyone's needs that somebody has to carry, and I mostly wasn't carrying. I noticed this. I told myself I'd fix it once the business stabilized. The business never fully stabilized, not in the way that would have made room for the fixing. Around the time Jack turned 6, Claire's company landed a major new client relationship, Derek Voss, 44, who owned 3 event venues across the Springfield area and was, by every account, one of the more successful men in that particular corner of the local business world. Claire started working directly with him on a series of high-profile weddings and corporate events, and for a while, I heard about him the way you hear about any demanding client. Derek wants this changed, Derek's difficult about budgets, Derek doesn't understand why things take as long as they take. Maya noticed things before I did. That's something I didn't understand until much later, and it still sits uncomfortably in my chest when I think about it, that my 12-year-old daughter was carrying a piece of this story long before I had any idea there was a story to carry. In April of that year, Claire had taken Maya along to the mall to pick out a dress for a cousin's confirmation, and while Claire stepped away to take a call, Maya had wandered toward the food court and seen her mother standing close to a man Maya didn't recognize, talking in a way that struck even a 12-year-old as different from how her mother talked to work colleagues. Maya didn't understand what she was seeing, not fully, but she understood something was off, the way kids often understand the shape of a thing before they understand its name. She didn't tell me. She told her best friend Sophia, sworn to secrecy, and then carried the weight of it alone for months, becoming quieter at home, spending more time at Sophia's house than she ever had before. Withdrawal I noticed and misread entirely as normal preteen distancing. I noticed other things too, that spring, though I filed each one under something harmless. Claire started keeping her phone face down more consistently. She started taking calls in the car in the driveway instead of coming inside first. She mentioned Derek's name less often at dinner, which I registered, vaguely, as odd. Usually when someone becomes less prominent in a person's conversation, it's because they've become more prominent somewhere else. Something shifted in her that spring too, something I couldn't have named then. She started criticizing me more precisely, more frequently, with a specificity that felt different from the tired general complaints of earlier years. "You never help me with anything," started appearing in arguments that had nothing to do with help. arguments about scheduling, about money, about things that felt only loosely connected to actual domestic labor. Looking back, I think she was building a case. I think some part of her needed the marriage to look unbearable in order to make sense of what she was already doing, or already considering doing, and every genuine frustration she'd been carrying for years became useful material for a story that had started, quietly, to serve a different purpose than simply describing our marriage. I didn't see any of that clearly at the time. I just knew the fights were getting sharper, and I responded the way I usually responded, by working more, coming home later, telling myself I'd address it once things calmed down at the shop. By early summer, the small signs had accumulated into something I couldn't keep explaining away, though God knows I tried. Claire's brother Nate lived 20 minutes away with his wife and their toddler, and he and Claire had always been close, closer, honestly, than Claire was with either of her sisters. Nate started acting strange around me that June, in a way I initially read as unrelated stress from his own life. He'd go quiet at family dinners when Claire mentioned work. He stopped making the easy jokes he usually made about my job, the good-natured ribbing about electricians and their van full of cable. Once, helping me move a grill into my truck after a cookout, he started to say something, "Hey, Ethan, listen, I need to tell you," and then stopped himself entirely, shook his head, said it was nothing, and never brought it up again that summer. I filed that under Nate being weird. I had a lot of things filed under categories that turned out, eventually, to be the same file. Our neighbor Diane, who'd been close with Claire since Maya and Diane's daughter were in the same kindergarten class years earlier, started treating me differently too, a kind of soft, uncomfortable warmth I couldn't place, an extra beat of eye contact when we crossed paths getting the mail, "How are you doing?" Really, that felt loaded with something I couldn't identify. For a while I actually wondered, absurdly, if something was going on between Claire and Diane's husband Rob, who worked in commercial real estate and crossed paths with the events industry more than I'd realized. I spent almost 2 weeks quietly, uselessly suspicious of Rob, watching for signs that never materialized, before I understood that Diane's discomfort had nothing to do with her own husband at all. She knew something, had known for a while, and the guilt of knowing was leaking out of her in every interaction she had with me, disguised as concern. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever felt a whole room's worth of people being subtly strange around you, and told yourself it was probably nothing, probably just you being paranoid, you already know how easy it is to talk yourself out of trusting your own instincts. I did that for months. Every single person around me seemed to know something I didn't, and I kept deciding that was less likely than the alternative, which was that I was imagining a pattern where there wasn't one. The financial piece came into focus almost by accident. I was doing our taxes early that year, trying to get ahead of the usual spring scramble, and pulling records from our joint savings account. I noticed a series of transfers over the previous 10 months, 600 here, 800 there, always described in Claire's own notes on the account as contingency or personal, small enough individually that they'd never triggered any alarm in our monthly budget conversations, but adding up, over the better part of a year, to just over $6,000. I didn't know, then, that this money had gone toward propping up cash flow gaps in Derek Voss's third venue, the newest one, the one that was hemorrhaging money in its first 18 months of operation in a way Derek had been quietly panicking about to almost nobody except the person managing his biggest events. I only knew, looking at those transfers, that money had been leaving our life in a pattern that didn't match anything Claire and I had discussed, and that the woman who'd spent months telling me I never helped enough around the house had apparently found $6,000 worth of help for someone else entirely. I asked her about it, carefully, one evening after the kids were in bed. "Hey, I was doing the taxes, what's this contingency stuff in savings? $6,000 over the year?" She didn't flinch the way I expected. She'd clearly had an answer ready. "It's for Maya's braces, and some stuff for my parents." I didn't want to make a big thing out of it every time. The explanation was smooth, plausible, delivered without hesitation, and it took me another 2 weeks of quiet checking to confirm that Maya's braces hadn't been paid for out of that account at all, that her parents hadn't received anything from us that year beyond the usual Christmas gift. That was the moment something in me went cold in a way I hadn't experienced before, not suspicion anymore, but the specific, settled understanding that my wife could lie to my face, smoothly, without a flicker, about something concrete and checkable, and that she'd clearly had practice. I still remember exactly how that felt, sitting at the kitchen table with the bank statement in front of me after she'd gone up to bed. Even now, something in my chest tightens thinking about how easy it had been for her, how ready the lie had come, like she'd rehearsed the possibility of being asked. She told me, much later, what those months had actually felt like from her side of things. I didn't know any of this yet, not that night at the kitchen table, not for weeks after. But this is what she was carrying, underneath the version of her I'd been living with. I told myself the money was temporary, that I'd put it back before anyone noticed, that this was just helping someone who needed it, nothing more complicated than that. Derek made me feel like the smartest person in every room we were in, and it had been so long since anyone made me feel that way that I stopped being able to tell the difference between being useful to him and being wanted by him. I told myself I deserved to matter to someone who saw the whole picture of who I was, not just the parts that kept the house running. Every time I moved money toward his venue I told myself it was the last time, that after this it would stop, and every time it didn't stop, I just got quieter about the next one. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. I started documenting things after that, quietly, the way you start keeping a private record once you no longer trust the person you're supposed to be sharing your life with. I photographed the bank statements. I began paying closer attention to her calendar, to the specific evenings labeled event walkthrough or vendor meeting that didn't match the venue's own public event schedule when I occasionally checked it online out of curiosity. I noticed a red herring during this stretch too, a name that kept appearing alongside Derek's in Claire's calendar notes, a woman named Priya who I initially assumed might be someone else entirely involved, a possible affair partner I'd misguessed the gender of, until I eventually learned Priya was simply Derek's operations manager, present at every meeting for entirely legitimate reasons. Her presence a coincidence that had cost me a week of suspicion aimed in the wrong direction. Maya's withdrawal deepened that summer too, though I didn't connect it to anything specific until much later. She stopped wanting to come with us to family gatherings where Nate would be present, as though being around adults who knew things made her more aware of the thing she herself was carrying. She started an argument with Claire over something trivial, a cancelled shopping trip, that escalated further than the trigger seemed to warrant, Maya shouting something about how Claire didn't even care about anyone but herself anymore, before slamming her bedroom door. I remember standing in the hallway after that, confused by the intensity of it, filing it under normal preteen volatility, when it was actually the closest Maya had come to saying out loud what she'd been holding in since April. I want to be honest about a decision I made that summer that I'm still not entirely at peace with. Rather than sitting Claire down and asking her directly what was happening, rather than risking a conversation where she could deny everything and I'd have nothing solid to stand on, I chose to keep gathering evidence quietly, on my own, for weeks longer than I probably needed to. I told myself I was being careful. The truer answer is that some part of me had already stopped believing a direct conversation would produce anything but more smooth, rehearsed lies, and I'd rather have proof than another performance. I started checking credit card statements more carefully and found a pattern of charges at a hotel on the north side of town, always on weekday afternoons, never overlapping with any event Claire's company had actually staged according to the public calendar I'd been tracking. 8 charges over 4 months, small enough, incidentals, a bar tab, valet, that they'd have meant nothing to anyone not already looking. Around this same time, Nate finally broke. He showed up at my shop on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, looking like he hadn't slept well in days, and asked if we could talk somewhere private. We stood behind the shop near the loading dock, and he told me, in halting, guilty pieces, that he'd known about Derek for almost 5 months, that Claire had told him in a moment of drunken vulnerability at their mother's birthday party back in the spring, sworn him to secrecy, and that he'd spent every month since regretting that promise more than he could say. He told me about the hotel. He told me, though he didn't have exact numbers, that he knew money had moved from our savings toward Derek's business, because Claire had mentioned it once, defensively, when Nate had pushed back on the affair itself. "I should have told you months ago," he said. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place. I don't think that anymore. I didn't yell at him. I understood, in a way I didn't fully articulate until later, that he'd been carrying an impossible weight, loyalty to his sister against loyalty to the truth, and that whatever mistake he'd made in staying silent that long, he'd made it out of love rather than malice. I told him I appreciated him finally telling me. I don't think I've fully forgiven him for the 5 months of silence, even now, but I understand the shape of what kept him quiet, in the way you understand things you might have done yourself in his position. That conversation gave me the last piece I needed to stop treating this as suspicion and start treating it as fact. Derek Voss. A hotel on the north side. $6,000 redirected from our savings into his failing venue. A daughter who'd apparently seen something 8 months earlier and told no one but a school friend. A neighbor whose discomfort suddenly made complete sense. I confirmed the timeline as best I could and found something that landed harder than almost anything else. The affair had started roughly 14 months earlier, well before most of the "you never help me" complaints had sharpened into their current, more pointed form. Which meant Claire hadn't started resenting me because of some accumulated failure on my part that then led her toward Derek. She'd started the affair first, for reasons that had more to do with her own old hunger to be seen than with anything I had specifically done, and the domestic complaints had intensified afterward, not as an honest grievance building toward a breaking point, but as a story she needed, consciously or not, to make her own choices feel justified. That realization changed something in how I understood the entire year. I'd spent months quietly absorbing her criticism, telling myself I needed to try harder, be more present, help more, genuinely trying, in fits and starts, to be better, believing the marriage's unhappiness was a problem I could fix through effort. Looking back, some of that effort had been running headlong into a house whose foundation had already shifted for reasons that had nothing to do with dish duty or school pickup schedules. I didn't confront her right away, even with everything I now knew. I spent another 3 weeks quietly meeting with a divorce attorney, a careful, methodical woman named Patricia Alvarez who explained Missouri's laws on marital asset dissipation and how documented evidence of funds diverted toward an affair partner's business could weigh heavily in a settlement. I made copies of every bank statement, every hotel charge, everything Nate had told me written down in my own words the same night he told me, dated, in case I ever needed to establish when I'd learned what. During this stretch, Maya finally told me what she'd seen at the mall the previous spring, not directly, not at first, but through a conversation that started because I noticed her crying in her room one evening and finally asked, gently, if something was going on that had nothing to do with school. She told me haltingly, guiltily, convinced somehow that she'd done something wrong by not telling me sooner, that she'd seen Mom with a man at the mall, that she hadn't understood what she'd seen but had known it felt wrong, that she'd been carrying it alone for months because she didn't know how to say it out loud without breaking something she couldn't take back. I held my daughter while she cried and told her, as steadily as I could manage, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that 12-year-olds shouldn't have to carry secrets like that whatever happened next between her mother and me was not her responsibility to manage or predict or prevent. She told me, much later, this next piece, what had been happening on her end during those same weeks, once she realized how close I'd gotten to the whole truth. I didn't know it yet, not while I was sitting with Maya that night. I almost told him everything, once, that same week. I'd started the sentence twice, Ethan, I need to tell you something, and both times I stopped myself, because some part of me still believed if I never actually said the words out loud, I could still find a way to make this stop without anyone getting hurt. I told myself I just needed more time to end things with Derek quietly, to fix the money somehow before anyone noticed, to become the wife I used to be before he ever noticed the difference. I didn't understand yet that the not telling had already become its own kind of hurting. That's what she told me. I didn't know any of it at the time. Everything came to a head on an ordinary Tuesday in September, and it started, of all things, over a load of laundry. I'd come home late from a job that ran over, tired in the specific bone-deep way that used to make me disappear into the couch without engaging with anyone. Claire had been building towards something for days, sharper comments, a tighter set to her jaw whenever I walked in, and that night it finally broke loose over the dryer, of all things, a completely ordinary domestic friction that somehow needed to hold the weight of everything else neither of us had said out loud yet. "You never help me with anything," she said, and I heard, underneath the familiar words, something different this time, not tired resignation but something closer to desperation, like she was trying to convince herself of a story before it collapsed. "I do everything in this house. I do everything for these kids. I can't do this anymore." I already had Patricia's advice in my head by then, already had the bank statements photographed and organized, already knew about Derek and the hotel and the $6,000 and everything Nate and Maya had each been carrying separately for months. I could have laid it all out right there in the kitchen. I chose not to, not yet, not that night. Something in me wanted to see exactly how far she'd take the story she'd built before I dismantled it. "Fine," I said. "Let's pack, then." She looked at me the way you look at someone who's stopped following the script you'd prepared. "What? You said you can't do this anymore." "Okay. I'm not going to fight you on it tonight." I walked past her into the bedroom, pulled the goods suitcase down from the closet shelf, unzipped it, and set it open on the bed. "You need help packing?" "I'm right here." For a moment, genuine confusion crossed her face. This wasn't the reaction she'd been building toward, the fight, the pleading, the version of this scene where I begged her to stay and she got to feel, one more time, like the wronged party in a marriage that had failed to appreciate her. I said almost nothing else. I folded shirts. I found her phone charger in the nightstand drawer and set it in the outer pocket of the suitcase. I moved through the room with a kind of methodical, hollowed-out calm that felt, from the outside, almost like helpfulness, and felt, from the inside, like something closer to withdrawal, like I had already left the room emotionally days or weeks earlier and my body was only now catching up. "Stop it," she said, her voice climbing. "Stop doing that. Why are you being like this?" "You said I never help," I said, still folding. "I'm helping." "This isn't, I didn't mean." She grabbed the shirt out of my hands, threw it back onto the bed. "You're doing this on purpose, to make me look crazy." "I'm not doing anything except what you asked." She shifted then, the way people shift when their first strategy stops working. "You know what, maybe I should leave. Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen, because you clearly don't care enough to actually fight for this marriage, you're just standing there folding my clothes like it's nothing." "Claire." I set down the shirt in my hands and looked at her directly for the first time since the fight started. "I know about Derek." The room went very quiet. She didn't gasp, didn't collapse, she went still instead, the specific stillness of someone recalculating everything in real time. "I know about the hotel," I continued. "I know about the money you moved out of savings. $6,000, over about 10 months, into his venue. I know Nate's known about this since your mom's birthday. I know Maya saw the two of you at the mall in April and has been carrying that alone ever since, because she didn't know how to tell me without breaking something. You had Nate spy on me?" Her voice sharpened, defensive, pivoting exactly the way I'd expected. "You had our daughter, you're using our 12-year-old against me now?" "I'm not using anyone. I'm telling you what I know. This is exactly what I'm talking about." She was pacing now, gesturing, building momentum in a direction that had nothing to do with the actual accusation. "This is exactly the problem, you turn everything into some kind of investigation, you don't trust me, you never have, you've spent this whole marriage checking up on me instead of actually being present, and now you want to make this about some hotel receipt instead of about the fact that I have been drowning in this house for years while you." "How long, Claire? Don't do that. Don't make this about some timeline like you're building a case against me. I already have the case built. I'm asking you a question." She wouldn't answer it directly. Every time I asked something specific, she redirected, toward my hours at the shop, toward times I'd missed dinner, toward a comment I'd made 3 years earlier about her spending, toward anything except Derek's name, as though if she could make the argument big enough, broad enough, about everything wrong in 11 years of marriage at once, the specific and undeniable thing at the center of it might get lost in the noise. I said almost nothing else that night. I finished packing the suitcase, methodically, without another word, and set it by the bedroom door. I told her I'd sleep in the guest room, and that we'd talk again once we'd both had time to think, and I walked out while she was still mid-sentence, still building an argument about years-old grievances that had nothing to do with the actual thing sitting between us. She didn't leave that night. The suitcase sat by the door for 3 days, untouched, before she finally moved it back into the closet herself, and neither of us mentioned it again. Nate came by 2 days later, ashen, having heard from Claire that I now knew, and apologized to me again in person, more thoroughly this time, for the months of silence. Diane, hearing some version of events through the neighborhood grapevine that moves faster than anyone admits, showed up at my door with a casserole and an expression of such transparent relief at finally being able to speak plainly that I understood, once and for all, exactly how much everyone around me had been carrying on my behalf. Even now, when I think back to that night in the bedroom, folding her shirts while she screamed about who I'd supposedly weaponized against her, something in my chest still tightens, not from anger exactly, but from the strange, hollow clarity of realizing how completely someone can rewrite the story of a marriage to keep from having to look at the actual thing they've done. Claire came to me 9 days after that fight, on a Saturday morning while the kids were at Nate's house for a sleepover reunion he'd arranged specifically, I think, to give us room to talk. She sat across from me at our kitchen table, hands wrapped around a coffee mug she didn't drink from, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she didn't start with an accusation. "I want to tell you the truth," she said. "Actual truth, not the version I gave you the other night." I nodded and let her talk. She told me everything. In her words, it started at the company holiday party, almost 14 months ago now. Derek said something about how the events I'd built for him were the reason his venue was surviving its first hard year, and I remember standing there thinking, nobody has said something like that to me in years, not about being useful, but about being good at something that mattered. I told myself it was just flattering, harmless, that I could enjoy being seen like that without it meaning anything. Then it was drinks after a walk-through. Then it was the hotel, and every single time I told myself that was the last time, right up until the next Thursday came around and it wasn't. When his newest venue started struggling with cash flow, moving money over felt like helping someone who genuinely needed it, and I told myself that made it different from what it actually was. I was terrified the whole time, of getting caught, of what it would do to Maya and Jack, of who I was becoming while I kept doing it anyway. There were nights I'd come home and see Maya's science fair project sitting on the counter and I couldn't look directly at it, couldn't stand still long enough in that kitchen to feel like the mother who was supposed to be helping her glue poster board together. I told myself the complaints I made about you were just honest frustration, and some of them were, Ethan, some of that was real, but I know now I made them sharper and more frequent than they needed to be, because some part of me needed you to look like the problem so I didn't have to look at myself as the one causing it. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I didn't feel the vindication I might have expected after months of quiet investigation. I felt tired, mostly, and something close to grief for the marriage we might have had if either of us had said any of this honestly years earlier, if I'd addressed my own absence instead of working through it, if she'd brought her hunger to be seen to me instead of to Derek, if either of us had trusted the other with the truth before the truth became something that had to be uncovered instead of shared. "I'm not staying in this," I told her. "I need you to hear that clearly." She cried, quietly, without the theatrics of the fight 9 days earlier, and I think some part of her had already known, sitting down at that table that morning, that this conversation wasn't going to end any other way. The divorce took just under 8 months. Patricia's documentation of the diverted savings, combined with the affair itself, meant the settlement favored me significantly. I kept the house, secured primary custody of Maya and Jack with Claire maintaining regular visitation, and the court ordered partial repayment of the diverted funds as part of the asset division. Derek Voss's third venue folded within the year regardless of Claire's contributions, and once his own wife filed for divorce upon learning the truth, through channels that had nothing to do with me, Springfield being smaller than anyone likes to admit, he lost far more than a struggling business. Claire kept her job at the venue company, though her reputation within it never fully recovered once the story became something colleagues discussed quietly rather than a secret anyone still bothered protecting. I didn't feel triumphant watching any of that unfold. I felt something quieter, the specific relief of a door finally closing on a room I'd been standing in far too long, waiting for permission to leave that I eventually learned I didn't need anyone else to grant me. I understand now that some of what Claire said, in those months of sharpening complaints, held a real grain of truth I hadn't fully faced, that I had let work consume the parts of me that should have gone toward being present for my family, that helping had become, for me too, a story I told myself instead of a thing I actually did consistently. That doesn't make what she did to cope with that absence right. It just means I've had to sit with my own share of the wiring that failed, long before I ever traced the fault back to its actual source. What's easiest to miss in this story, if you only follow the affair itself, is how carefully Claire built the domestic grievance around it, not as a lie exactly, since some of the underlying frustration was real, but as a story reshaped and sharpened until it could carry weight it was never honestly meant to carry. That's the real deception here, not just the hotel, not just the money, but the slow rewriting of an entire marriage's history into something that made her own choices feel survivable. Ethan's silence about his own absence, the missed dinners, the exhaustion that calcified into distance, created exactly the kind of gap a story like Claire's needed to take root in. That doesn't excuse what she did with that gap. It explains why the gap existed to be exploited in the first place, and the story only works honestly if both truths are held at once. The real turning point wasn't the bank statement or the hotel charges, it was the moment, months earlier, when Nate chose silence over honesty at his mother's birthday party, and the moment Maya chose silence over telling her father what she'd seen at the mall. Two people who loved Ethan carried a truth that might have changed everything months sooner, and their silence, however understandable, let the deception grow roots deep enough that by the time it surfaced, almost nothing in the marriage remained untouched by it. This story isn't really about who did more housework. It's about how easily a real grievance can be weaponized into a cover story, and how much quieter deception can hide inside the people who love us most, each one convinced their silence is protecting someone. Which leaves a question worth sitting with: how many of us have stayed quiet about something we suspected, telling ourselves it wasn't our place to say, and what might have changed if we'd said it anyway, sooner, even clumsily, even at the cost of being the one who broke the silence first. I still think about that suitcase, unzipped and empty on our bed, more than almost anything else from that year. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't, not really, just a man quietly folding shirts while his marriage came apart around him, but because it's the moment I stopped absorbing a story that wasn't true and started insisting on the one that was. What stays with me now is how long it took me to understand that, "you never help me," can be both partly true and also a weapon, and that the two things aren't as far apart as I once believed. If you've ever had someone hand you a complaint that felt bigger than the moment it arrived in, I'd gently ask you to wonder what else it might be carrying. If someone built a story about you that wasn't quite honest, or you've ever stayed quiet about something you suspected because it wasn't your place to say, tell me one word for it in the comments. I read every one, and thank you, genuinely, for staying with this story all the way through.